Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. This is episode 18. My name is Tom Luongo. We have a lot to talk about. It's Tuesday, January 28th, 2020, and Iran is back in the news. A motion to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is moving through the Iranian parliament in response to Europe triggering the dispute clause of the JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. These events put us firmly on the path to an ultimate showdown between the U.S. and Iran. Before I get to that, I want to remind you that you can follow my work at my blog at tomluongo.me. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. Live streams, they happen on YouTube and DLive.tv every Monday night at 8 p.m. and Friday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, warning, I'm a bad boy, I've got a potty mouth, and I am not afraid to use it. You can also support verified publishers like me by downloading and installing the Brave browser, where you can get paid in crypto tokens called BAT for voluntarily being served internet advertising as opposed to feeding the Google beast. Brave protects your online privacy while saving you time and bandwidth by blocking all those pesky data snoopers, etc. that are feeding the growing surveillance state. You can use my referral code at brave.com/Tom148 to support the podcast directly. If you use Brave for more than 30 days, I'll get the referral fee. And lastly, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns, where you can sign up for either the private market reports published every Wednesday and Sunday, and or the Gold, Goats, and Guns monthly investment newsletter that's designed to wrap up all the geopolitical chaos, the global macroeconomics, and shifting cultural trends into a portfolio strategy designed to help you make sense of a world going mad. Iran is moving away from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it is a signatory of, and India, Pakistan, and Israel are not, right? Now, this is a move that has garnered a lot of consternation because it looks like the move that provokes the ultimate response from the United States. Now, it's walking away from any legal restraints on it developing nuclear weapons. It has that as, along with the JCPOA, those two things were supposed to work in tandem to keep Iran from developing anything other than a civilian nuclear program. And even that, the JCPOA, for the most part, stopped them from doing that as well. They really still had to ultimately buy their nuclear fuel from somebody else if they wanted to have atomic energy. And that in and of itself is frankly offensive because, again, what's the purpose of keeping Iran from developing an electrical grid that is first world? Because it's first world countries that have nuclear power as their baseload energy source for their electricity. We have it in the United States. France is well beyond baseload, so are the Russians and even the Germans. And the Germans are walking away from nuclear energy, and it's actually part of the massive geopolitical wrangling over things like Nord Stream 2. Because the Germans are going to somehow run their economy without a nuclear baseload, and that seems odd for a first world industrialized economy. But regardless of that, going back to Iran, the reason they're moving away from the NPT is because this is the only way they can legally threaten to build the nuclear weapon that everybody is hoping that they never produce, right? And that the JCPOA was supposed to stop. So now the question is has Iran been, full of it the entire time, and has the JCPOA been nothing more than a bad deal as Donald Trump and Netanyahu and others believe it has been? Or was it ultimately the best deal they were going to get under the circumstances? So what Iran has been doing has been, if you look at what they've been doing over the past year and a half or nearly 2 years now, since Trump unilaterally withdrew from the deal, was to stepwise remove itself from the JCPOA per the agreement so that they do not look and they are in no way in violation of the agreement. And so Trump, whether he did it himself or he was forced into given political circumstances in the United States, put unbelievable pressure on Europe to trigger the dispute mechanism within the JCPOA to call Iran a bunch of liars and not being in non-compliance with the deal. Now, do we have proof of this? No. Up to this point, we have nothing more than what the IAEA, the arm of the UN that's in charge of international energy monitoring and whatnot, and they're the ones that are in charge of monitoring Iran's nuclear program, have given Iran a clean bill of health on everything, for the most part, the little niggling little things that they've been quote unquote cheating on, but nothing that violates the spirit, certainly the spirit of the deal at any functional level. Now, there's some issues about whether or not they're enriching uranium at a rate faster than the stated number of centrifuges they have and all of that. But, the truth of the matter is that that's up in the air. And that's a fungible number, given that their total uranium stockpiles could include yellowcake. And yellowcake is not enriched uranium, and yellowcake stockpiles don't matter. but they're also part of the total stockpile that Iran has. So they're mining uranium. They could be buying it on the open market from the Russians. They could be doing all sorts of things. They could be getting it from the Russians in return for other forms of trade. We don't know. And none of that ultimately is a violation of what the JCPOA was designed to do, in my opinion, which was to stop them from enriching beyond a certain point that would then put them on the path to obtaining a weapon. Period. So given the rate at which they're enriching uranium, or the rate at which their stockpile is rising, then we're now looking probably at a breakout period for Iran that's far less than a year when they reach the point where they'll have around 1,000 kilograms of enriched uranium, which they can use to build a dirty bomb. They'll have a nuke that they could then miniaturize and stick on one of their ballistic missiles. And of course, they'll use the North Korean design because the North Koreans did that work for them. The question is, what does this mean, right? The response from the United States to this ultimately has to be, as I said in previous podcasts, in previous writings, the ultimate goal here then for the United States, the only move we'll have left if we want to stop Iran from getting the bomb, is to honestly start negotiating a new deal, which is not possible with Donald Trump because of what he's done, or bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. And so now it looks like Iran is inviting a massive attack on its sovereignty, even though it's supposedly doing everything within its legal framework. The pressure that we put on the Europeans to trigger the dispute mechanism within the JCPOA was done completely in order to get this into the United Nations Security Council, because that's the process under the JCPOA of how this would work. Even though, to this point, the EU3, the UK, France, and Germany don't believe that Iran has been violating the deal in that respect. And they haven't been violating the deal. It doesn't matter. The way the deal is structured, once the dispute mechanism has been triggered, it goes to the UN Security Council, and then a unanimous vote has to happen in order for sanctions not to go back on Iran. And what are the chances of that happening? Zero. The United States has maneuvered everybody into this position so that they could veto the vote in the United Nations Security Council in order to put sanctions back on Iran that existed pre the deal. They want the deal destroyed. Okay? Period. And this has been the strategy from the beginning, as run by Bolton, Pompeo, and Trump. This is the path to getting Iran to come to the table to negotiate a new deal. That's what they think is happening. It was always the plan to get to this moment. But Iran's not going to submit here. And so the next step has to be escalation. When Iran says, no, we're not coming to the table, we don't trust you, Trump, we're not going to work with you. At that point, the sanctions go back on, and all the signatories then have to put those sanctions back on. So now it's going to push Russia and China to put their sanctions back on Iran. And that's a big question as to how that's going to play itself out. I don't think the Russians and the Chinese are going to go along with that. I don't. They may waffle for the first couple of months, but I think ultimately, while they're doing this, while this is happening, okay, the Russians and the Chinese are going to play the game of going along with it and saying, yes, we have to do this, but then not actually implementing it or, playing the political game. And they're going to drag their feet on this as much as humanly possible. Okay. They're going to do that because while that's going on, if Iran moves out of the NPT treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, at some point, all of those agreements break down and Iran is legally allowed to pursue this path. And there's no longer any agreements. The sanctions then no longer effectively bind the Russians and the Chinese because Iran is no longer a signatory to the NPT. And therefore, they'll be able to ignore the sanctions and get back on board, but they'll be able to do it legally. And this is very important to Putin because ultimately he's still trying to cozy up to the European Union and bring them into the fold while playing against an incredibly belligerent set of neocons that are running U.S. foreign policy right now. Now, when you analyze the way the Iranians and the Russians do geopolitics, we see one thing. They play chess. The Russians and Russian military strategy has always centered around the idea of cauldrons. Now, cauldron is something where you try to encircle your enemy and cut him off from his resupply. So if you've got a stable contact line, militarily speaking, if you outflank from both the left and the right and try and close the loop so that you close the circle around a particular point, then you create a circle, trap those troops, and then cut them off from resupply and then collapse the cauldron. I mean, Russian military techniques aren't particularly sophisticated. They're pretty simple. And they have two variations on this. They either flank from both sides or they allow a weak point right in the middle and allow an attack to go through, and then they encircle from behind when the attack overextends itself. And that's the key word, overextend. Vladimir Putin is an eighth dan in judo. Judo is all about using your opponent's energy against him to push him in the direction you want him to go ultimately, and then put him on the ground and then do whatever you're going to do to him, break his neck, subdue him, take the knife away from him, whatever you're going to do. I mean, I've studied martial arts on and off for the last 20 years. I understand these concepts very well. And so Putin is a master at geopolitical judo. You allow your opponent to overextend themselves, just like the U.S. and company overextended themselves in Syria, and then you reverse them. And then you hang them with their own words, you hang them with their own narrative, you hang them with everything. And I think that's what's being set up here. Now, I don't have complete spidey sense or complete magic 8-ball on this at this point. I just know that this is the only thing that makes sense to me. That if you're going to beat an overwhelmingly powerful enemy like the United States, that is throwing that power around willy-nilly, in almost every direction. And you're dealing with people who psychologically believe they cannot be beaten because of this overwhelming power. I'm talking about the neoconservative. Then this type of strategy, inviting the attack, makes perfect sense. Ultimately, this is what I think has to happen. So that's what I think is happening here. I'm not sure that I have it all worked out as to how it's all going to play out, but I'm telling you from a strategy perspective, this is what makes sense to me. So now we have two scenarios. Because now the question is, if that's the case, then how? And we're going to go through some of this here. But there's two scenarios here that I need you to understand. Because Russia and China's response to the way this plays out in the UN Security Council relative to the JCPOA and Iran removing itself from the NPT is that here's the two things. If Iran was cheating on the JCPOA, as Trump and company accuse, then the whole purpose of the deal itself was nothing more than a delaying tactic. In fact, the more I think about the JCPOA, the more I think it was a delaying tactic, period. It allows Russia, China, and Iran time to build their alliance, to undo the conflict in Syria, to allow the situations in Iraq and Afghanistan to get to a point where local populations would move against U.S. rule there. It would allow them to build an axis of resistance that was real. Right? That was real and powerful. It also gives them time to build an alternative financial infrastructure and to coordinate all of their military strategy. Remember, all of this stuff started with the killing of Soleimani and everything else happened the same week that the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians were holding naval drills off the coast of Iran. So continue to play that out and think about it in terms of the two major strikes we've had now against U.S. allied forces in the last 6 months. And we got three events. We've got the supposed Houthi attack on the Abqaiq Aramco facility in Saudi Arabia back in September. We have the strike in response to the Soleimani killing on the two U.S. bases in Iraq. And then we have yesterday's events of the E11-a Communications plane being shot down over Afghanistan. Now, that's something I'm going to cover separately in a minute. Those two missile strikes betray a massive, massive level of accuracy that the United States, I don't think, had any inkling that Iran had that kind of capability. I want to read you something from Pepe Escobar, the great international journalist. And he put up on his VK account the other day. So I want you to factor this in when you start thinking about what's the U.S.'s potential response here is. He says that here's the Iranian missile accuracy in 30 seconds. There's no links here. There's nothing else. It's just, these are kind of his thoughts on the situation and what he knows behind the scenes. He's saying that Debka Mossad is spinning this like crazy. They are convinced that the high-precision technology accounting for the astonishing accuracy of Iran's missile strike on the U.S. Ain al-Assad base in Iraq on January 8th came from Moscow. The spin is that the GLONASS global navigation system, the Russian version of American GPS, reduced the missile's targeting error to just 10 meters. It was actually a lot less than that. This caught the U.S. and Israeli intelligence by complete surprise. Intelligence surprise number one. Of course, their ground intel is less than zero. There is no smoking gun that Iran is using GLONASS. If they are, credit fabulous Russian intel for keeping it a secret, but think about the possibilities. And already, Debka Mossad and the exceptionalists, meaning the American neocons, know for sure that Iran's short and medium-range missiles can reach any target all across the Middle East, even if they are protected by those lousy Patriots and/or Iron Dome systems. They can run, but they can't hide. Now, what Escobar is saying here is that he's saying that Iran has native ability to do this. I've been saying that I think the Russians have been working with the Iranians behind the scenes to give them electronic warfare and radar evasion technology, because it makes perfect sense. If you're going to invite a cauldron strategy, if you're going to invite the attack against Iran, because they're the weakest link militarily, which they are, right? Then it makes perfect sense to give them an asymmetric threat that the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia didn't know about. So you invite them in saying, oh, well, we're going to put maximum pressure on you, to the point of you needing to submit at that point, from between economic pressure and military pressure and political pressure and everything else. We're going to cut you off from everybody. We're going to isolate you from the world. And then we're going to poke the snake, and we're going to put you in a position to have to deal with some kind of false flag incident to give a casus belli, i.e. our Global Hawk drone flying in Iranian airspace last June, and then Iran shot the drone down. And then all of a sudden, well, how did that happen? And then 2 months later, there's a strike on Saudi oil processing facilities. That took everybody by surprise. And then Iran sends missiles at our bases and targets with precision places that cause the highest probability of causing no casualties. Again, message sent, message delivered. We have asymmetric capabilities, not just militarily, but because of the potential global financial effects of this type of asymmetric warfare. They lob a few hundred missiles at particular places around the Middle East, and oil's at $300 a barrel. And that's where the United States is most vulnerable. They're not vulnerable militarily. If the United States wants to wipe Iran out and send it back to the Stone Ages, we can do that in about 24 hours, maybe 48. I mean, seriously. I mean, by the end of the week, we could be like, we're done. Then we're going home for the weekend. Job accomplished. It's, the weekend. Crack a cold one. That's the level of mismatch militarily in those terms. Does that stop Iran from getting a bomb? Yeah. Does that invite a global financial meltdown? Oh, absolutely. And I've been saying this since June. So maybe this is the cauldron strategy. So what's the point then in slowly but surely having Iran walk away from the JCPOA? It creates time. It creates a burbling within the global financial system to put things more and more and more tenuous position, which is where we are right now. Federal Reserve can't get away from the repo markets. It's monetizing tons of debt every month. All the major central banks are talking about massive money printing in order to combat global warming. All these things are right here in front of us. All we're waiting for is a spark. Is it the coronavirus? It could be. See, I think they're inviting the U.S. to try and attack in such a way that they can then, this is the threat. Look, we're inviting you to attack us. And if you do, this is what's going to happen. We're going to destroy the Saudi Arabians' ability to produce any oil for 6 months. They don't have to close the Straits of Hormuz. They don't even play that game. That's a diversionary tactic. You remove Saudi and UAE oil from the market, everything changes. And so Russia and China may have to allow the sanctions to snap back into place if Iran has been cheating on the deal. And so that may play itself out, and you may hear a lot of pro-Russian analysts screaming at Putin for why he's not defending his ally Iran. Prepare for that, because it's very possible. So the next thing to talk about is what happens if Iran hasn't been cheating and has been ramping up within the purview of the JCPOA. What happens then? Well, the U.S. is more vulnerable than everybody thinks, because if Iran hasn't been cheating on the deal, then forcing the deal to collapse only makes everybody even angrier at the United States than they already are right now. The sanctions will then be ad hoc. They won't be mandated by former UN Security Council resolutions. And you might even see a number of countries break with the United States over this. Certainly Russia and China will, and they'll reopen trade with Iran as quickly as possible. And Trump's economic pressure campaign fails. And it may reach its zenith here in the next month or two and then start to peter off. And then at that point, we have two things. Iran is free from both the NPT and the JCPOA and is free to pursue nukes. Not a sober thought here. And this is not something I want to see happen. But tactically and strategically, I'm just playing it out. Okay, so Iran is free to pursue nukes. And then what happens? Trump has to negotiate. But he has to negotiate from having no leverage other than, we're going to bomb you. But that means the end of the U.S. financial empire. So do you think that's going to happen? Again, you're putting a situation together, a multivariable situation together to put the neocons in the position to put up or shut up. Are we going to have a nuclear war or aren't we? And most people are against nuclear war, and Trump wants to get reelected. So everybody has an endgame, folks. And thinking that Iran doesn't have an endgame with its walking away from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's a dumb argument. Iran has never shown itself, really, to be any kind of wild-eyed actor. So now let's bring in the plane crash in Afghanistan. So that was an E11-a BACN mobile communications platform, a modified private jet, effectively. The big news on this is that Mike DeAngelo, the head of the CIA anti-Iran division, is dead. Okay, his Wikipedia entry is being modified. All sorts of things are happening. He's dead. And he was the guy who ordered and organized the hit on Soleimani. So this is actually Iran's revenge for Soleimani, not the airbase attack. The airbase attack was a message that we can strike all of your assets across the Middle East at any point, and there's nothing you can do about it. Because I want you to understand something. The United States didn't respond to this. I didn't see Mike Pompeo out there bloviating, after having left the freaking buffet bar going, it's Iran and they're evil and this typical crap that he spews. No, he's silent. He's not saying anything. All of the American commentary on this has been very terse, meaning they don't know how this happened because no one was supposed to know that DeAngelo was supposed to be on that plane. So this is a massive intelligence breakdown. Soleimani traveled in the open. It wasn't particularly that difficult to figure out where he was going to be. DeAngelo, no way. No way. Knowing where he was going to be in Afghanistan and then they blew him up. Because, okay, fine. We're going to say that there was no weapon involved. Fine. You sabotage the engines. Then that opens up a whole massive number of questions. What level of sabotage, what level of insecurity do we have in Afghanistan? By downplaying this event means that something else is happening, and it's big. I think it has good connotations in the long run, because DeAngelo was on that plane as a precaution post-Soleimani, right? All of our major government officials, military officials, would be taking extra precautions to make sure that they weren't struck against. And yet, within 3 weeks, oops. So it says a number of things. It says we can't protect neither our bases nor our people in the region. The neocons will now argue for more troops into Afghanistan, which is a non-starter for Americans. Trump wants a new Iran deal and to pull out, but that's not on the table at this point as long as he's under an impeachment threat. And look at what's happening. All across Iraq, the uprisings are escalating. Muqtada al-Sadr is organizing million-man marches in Baghdad. The number of rockets and missiles hitting various U.S. bases around the country are escalating. So we bring the impeachment into this. It's the thing that's binding down Donald Trump. And so now we get into John Bolton. And John Bolton is a very dangerous man. Martin Armstrong had a great little post this morning up on blog about this. That Bolton is just a dangerous neocon that wants war with everybody. It's why he was fired. Well, it's true. And he's going to try and hurt Trump. Going back on what I said a couple of weeks ago in my podcast when I thought that Bolton would turn states on the Democrats and then support Trump. I don't think that's going to happen at all. I think Bolton is going to go out of his way to try and hurt Trump as much as possible. And you got Bolton on the one side, and you got Biden on the other. And I think they're both up to their eyeballs in this Ukraine thing. I think they're both up to their eyeballs in this Iran thing. And we're going to see a situation as to whether or not there's going to be a negotiation as to whether both of them stand or neither of them stand as witnesses. And if both of them stand, this thing goes on for months and it gets ugly and a lot of people get implicated. And watch Lindsey Graham very carefully because I know he's playing both sides and he's mostly playing Israel's side. Now, this is all happening the same day that Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz in the United States to unveil Trump's deal of the century for the Palestinians, which is going to go nowhere. Bibi was just indicted this morning by the Knesset. He withdrew his immunity plea because he was never going to get it. And it looks like Trump is going to try and schmooze Gantz into forming a coalition government with Netanyahu to keep Netanyahu in power for as long as possible in order to try and make all this fly. I don't think it's going to work because the United States doesn't have any leverage to enforce this deal if they don't have any military leverage ultimately in the Middle East. Now, they have military leverage, but not any that they can use effectively. That's the point. This is the point I've been trying to make to so many people since June. We have all of this overwhelming firepower, but we can't actually use it because Iran's ability to strike asymmetrically is so much higher than people want to admit. And the asymmetric fight is to attack the United States where we're most vulnerable, which is in the debt markets. It doesn't mean that Iran can stand up to us with its fast attack boats and its, 3 submarines and, its F-4 fighters. No, it's not possible. But you lob a few thousand missiles at every strategic facility in the Middle East, and you cause the fall of the Saudi government. This is what we're talking about. There are not enough dollars in the world for that. There just ain't. And I think Trump understands this. I think he's been told this. I think he's been briefed on this. And I think the biggest problem here is that, as I've said for months, the flying monkeys are in charge. They want their pound of flesh, and they see this as their moment to get what they want. They see it's all worked to their advantage up to this moment. And then what? You get what you want, and you get sucked into the cauldron, and you get reversed. Because then you're there, and you got everything, but you can't use it. And if the impeachment is the thing that's pushing on Trump to do what he doesn't want to do, which is threaten Iran with effectively a bombing, which lights up the Middle East, I don't know that Trump goes for this. I just don't. I mean, if he's removed from office because of it, well, he'll go down as a hero. We still might wind up being in the same place 6 months from now after Hillary's elected. Because I talked about in my last podcast, and I want you to go over that, the implications of that. But it's what Trump has to do. And I don't know that he has the moral character or fiber or anything to do that. I hope he does. I hope at the final moment of crisis, he does the right thing like he's done the last couple of times. And then just starts putting people in jail for being traitors, because that's what he needs to do. We'll see. I don't know. It's very sobering, all of this stuff. I think the strategy domestically is for Trump to get past this impeachment so that he can go on his personal vendetta. And of course, the people who are opposed to him are not going to allow him to do that. So there's something else will come up, and he'll never be able to go on the personal vendetta that he needs to wipe everything clean. I think that's ultimately where his best value is, because he's destroyed his credibility on all treaties and the ability to make any deal that sticks. He can't enforce a deal. The deal of the century is not enforceable. Any kind of new version of the JCPOA isn't enforceable. START treaty, this treaty, that new, intermediate range missile treaty, all of it. None of it matters. He's thrown it all away thanks to John Bolton. He's made himself into a laughingstock. The great deal maker can't negotiate his way to the bathroom. And it's a shame. It's tragic. It's terrible, because I know that we've got some kind of deal ultimately, but he's not being allowed. And so you have to, at some point, you've got to figure out a strategy in order to depower these people and discredit them completely. That's the ultimate goal. And I think that's what Russia, China, and Iran are doing. That's their cauldron. And if that happens, remember, Russia's biding its time with the EU, wants to stay on side with them, try and get sanctions lifted there. The EU wants sanctions lifted, other than the hardcore globalists. They are mostly in the European Commission at this point, but it takes the Council of Foreign Ministers of the EU to re-up most of the sanctions. And at some point, Italy or somebody could stand up and go, nope, sorry, we're done. We're out. If China and Russia find it a way around the sanctions, and China can start upping its imports of Iranian oil from 250,000 barrels a day back to 800,000 barrels a day, they're not buying from the U.S. shale producers anymore. I got news for you. Trump's economic pressure campaign fails. Iran wins. Turkey continues buying oil from Iran, and, Iraq and Iran still have their economic integration. And at the end of the day, Iraq's got $35 billion sitting in an account with the Federal Reserve that Trump has threatened to seize. The truth of the matter is that the Chinese will just give them that money if they need to keep the Iraqi government from failing. It's not like they don't have the money. They have the money. The Russians have the money. The Russians' trade surplus is currently $13 billion a month. Eventually, that money will get unfrozen and the loans can get paid back. It'll happen. Ultimately, at the end of the day, Iran wants the U.S. out of the Middle East. This is the bottom line. Iran wants the U.S. out of the Middle East, then it'll cut a deal with Israel. It will, because the United States isn't going to leave the Middle East completely. It'll just leave Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, all of that. But it's not going to leave Saudi Arabia. It's not going to leave Israel or anything like that. And Putin and Xi will ensure that Iran doesn't get uppity. I firmly believe that is ultimately the game plan here. We go right back to what I was saying 3 years ago, that there's a grand bargain that's possible here, where Russia and China guarantee Iran's behavior, and the United States guarantees Israel and Saudi Arabia's behavior, and everybody steps down. But we have to go through this peak of hostility first because of the people who are driving U.S. and, frankly, British foreign policy. And we got to discredit them first before that grand bargain can actually happen. And I think that's where that's the state we're approaching. So on the one hand, Iran wants the United States out of the Middle East. On the other hand, the United States wants Iran not to have a nuke. And that's the wedge. And that's your basis for negotiation. So from Iran's standpoint, if you contain Israel by bringing Putin and Xi in to mediate, then you have the formation of a basis for a deal. But you have to defeat the neocons here at home. You have to separate American policymakers from Israel. That's going to be hard. That means you have to discredit Pompeo and Bolton. Netanyahu needs to be removed from power. Trump has to survive impeachment and most likely get reelected. I don't think Trump wants a war at all, but he doesn't want Iran with a nuke. And I think that he's being maneuvered into a position where he is being forced into the Kobayashi Maru. He's being forced into the moment where he has to bomb Iran, which he doesn't want to do. And if he does that, it's going to be bad for everybody. So ultimately, when you look at the situation, as I've laid it out here, a deal has to happen or the U.S. crosses a line that blows up the world and blows up its empire. And I think that the Trotskyite neocons don't care about any of that. I really don't think they care. I don't think the Steve Bannons and the John Boltons and the Mike Pompeos and the rest of them, Mike Pences and the rest of them, I don't think they care. And because of that, I think Russia, Iran, and China have set up the cauldron to destroy them perfectly. This has been the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast for Tuesday, January 28th, 2020. If you like what you heard today, please give a like, a subscribe, review me on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to this. Okay, you can get the podcast through the RSS feed, which is published on my blog with each new episode. So want to listen to it on whatever platform you choose. I'll be back hopefully later in the week. I've got some interview requests in with a bunch of heavy hitters. I'm hoping to get some of those people on board in the next couple of weeks, and we'll spice things up a little bit and it won't just be me ranting into a microphone, which is always better. All right, you guys take care. You have a great week. We will talk soon. Be well and keep your stick on the ice.